The click that changed the dynamic didn't sound like much. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo through the house. It didn't demand attention. It was the kind of sound you'd miss if the faucet were running or if your mind were somewhere else. But I heard it. And more importantly, I felt it. Before that moment, the bathroom door had always been casual. Half open. Fully open. Sometimes pushed closed, but never locked. It wasn't about a lack of privacy. It was about comfort. About knowing that nothing needed to be hidden. You could brush your teeth while the other person sat on the bed talking. You could complain about your day through the steam of the shower. You could exist without managing the image. Then one day, the door closed completely. And this time, it locked. It's strange how something so small can carry so much meaning. A door is just a door. A lock is just a mechanism. But inside a relationship, routines are signals. When those routines shift, the balance shifts with them. The click said, "This is mine now. This space. This moment. This boundary." And boundaries are healthy, right? That's what we're told. Everyone deserves privacy. Everyone deserves space. That's true. But this wasn't about healthy independence. This was about a subtle withdrawal. A quiet reclaiming of territory that used to be shared. Power doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like disengagement. Like choosing when access is granted and when it isn't. Like deciding who gets to witness your unfiltered self and who waits outside. I remember standing there, pretending not to notice. Pretending it didn't matter. Because reacting to a bathroom door feels dramatic. It feels insecure. Who questions a closed door? But relationships aren't built on isolated events. They're built on patterns. And when a pattern breaks, your body knows before your logic catches up. The dynamic changed because the door changed. Before, we moved around each other easily. There was an unspoken understanding that we were on the same level. No one was guarding themselves. No one was calculating exposure. The open door meant access. Access meant trust. Trust meant balance. When the door locked, access became conditional. Conditional access shifts power. The person inside decides when to open it. The person outside waits. And waiting creates vulnerability. It creates questions you didn't have to ask before. Why now? What changed? Is this about space, or is it about distance? You start replaying small moments. Conversations that felt slightly off. Texts that came slower than usual. The way eye contact lasted a second less. None of it strong enough to accuse. But together, they form a pattern. The click becomes the confirmation. Power shifts rarely arrive with arguments. They arrive with restraint, with holding back, with the quiet decision to manage what the other person sees. When the door stayed open, flaws were visible. Bad moods were visible. Messy hair, tired eyes, frustration. There was no performance. But once it closed, presentation started to matter. And presentation introduces hierarchy. The one who controls the image controls perception. And perception is power. I didn't confront it. Not then. Because part of me hoped it was nothing. That maybe it was just a new preference. A random habit. But deep down, I knew this wasn't random. It was a shift from us to me. The click wasn't aggressive. It was calm. Controlled. Intentional. That's what made it powerful. It signaled that something once shared had become private. That something once assumed had to be earned again. And when you have to earn what used to be given freely, the balance is no longer equal. You start adjusting without realizing it. Speaking softer. Asking fewer questions. Giving more space than you actually want to. Because when someone closes a door, you don't want to be the person who knocks too hard. You tell yourself you're respecting boundaries. But really, you're adapting to a new structure where you have less access, less influence, less certainty. And the person inside the bathroom may not even recognize the shift. That's the quiet danger. Power shifts often happen without malicious intent. They happen when one person slowly pulls inward and the other keeps leaning forward. The click marks the moment when leaning forward turns into waiting. Waiting to be let back in. Waiting to be reassured. Waiting for the door to open the way it used to. But it doesn't open the same way. And even when it does, something has already changed. Privacy as a new boundary didn't arrive with a conversation. It wasn't introduced with, "Hey, I need more space." It didn't come with reassurance or context. It showed up quietly, disguised as something reasonable, something mature. something that no one could argue against without sounding controlling. I just need a little privacy. It's a simple sentence. Healthy, even. In theory, privacy is a sign of individuality. It means you're not dissolving into someone else. It means you still have your own thoughts, your own rituals, your own interior world. That's important. No relationship should erase that. But this wasn't about maintaining identity. This was about redefining access. There's a difference between having private moments and building private walls. One allows breathing room. The other redraws the map. Before privacy became a boundary, closeness felt effortless. Phones left face up. Conversations shared in real time. Random thoughts spoken without filtering. You didn't feel like you were intruding by simply existing in the same space. You didn't have to request entry into moments that used to unfold naturally. Then the shift started small. The phone flipped face down. Not dramatically, just casually. The screen dimmed a little faster. Messages got answered in another room. The explanation was always neutral. Work stuff. Just random. Nothing important. And maybe it was nothing. But it felt like something. Privacy became the shield that protected new distance. The tricky part is that privacy is valid. You can't argue against someone's right to it. Doing so makes you look insecure, suspicious. So instead of questioning the boundary, you question yourself. Why does this bother me? Am I overthinking? Am I being unreasonable? But your discomfort isn't about controlling someone's space. It's about recognizing that the rules have changed without your agreement. When privacy becomes a new boundary in an established dynamic, it shifts power in subtle ways. The person who sets the boundary defines the terms. The other person adapts. An adaptation can look like shrinking. You stop asking follow-up questions because you don't want to seem intrusive. You hesitate before walking into rooms that used to be open. You knock on emotional doors that never required knocking before. The language changes too. It moves from we to I, from shared plans to individual schedules, from transparency to selective disclosure. Privacy, in its healthy form, still allows connection. It says, I have my own space, but you are still welcome in my world. Unhealthy privacy says, this is mine, and you don't get to question it. That distinction is everything. When privacy becomes a boundary without mutual understanding, it creates imbalance. The person who claims privacy gains control over information. And information is leverage. They decide what you know, when you know it, how much you know. The other person starts operating in partial light. You feel the gap in conversations. Details missing. Stories shortened. Energy redirected elsewhere. But you can't point to a clear violation. There's no obvious betrayal. Just less. Less sharing. Less openness. Less spontaneous connection. And because nothing dramatic has happened, you convince yourself it's normal. People evolve. Relationships change. Everyone needs space. But space without reassurance feels like distance. There's a moment when you realize you're being managed. Not lied to. Not attacked. Just managed. Information delivered carefully. Emotions edited. Access controlled. That's when privacy stops being neutral. It becomes a boundary that protects more than individuality. It protects separation. And separation shifts power. The one who withholds decides the rhythm. They can step forward or backward at will. The one outside the boundary waits for cues, for invitations, for cracks in the wall. You begin to feel like a guest in a space that used to be shared. You monitor your reactions. You rehearse your questions before asking them. You soften your tone to avoid triggering defensiveness. Because once privacy has been declared, any curiosity can be labeled as intrusion. And no one wants to be accused of crossing a line. So you step back. You give more room than you want to. You accept explanations that feel incomplete. You pretend the distance doesn't register, all while sensing that something foundational has shifted. Privacy, when mutually understood, builds respect. But when it's introduced unilaterally, it redistributes influence. It changes who holds control over connection. And connection used to be equal. Now it feels negotiated. Now it feels measured. Now it feels like access is granted in portions instead of shared freely. Silence where comfort used to live is louder than any argument. There was a time when quiet felt safe. You could sit in the same room without speaking and still feel connected. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of ease, full of understanding. You didn't need to fill every gap with words because the presence itself was enough. Then something shifted. The silence didn't disappear. It stayed, but it changed texture. Before it felt warm. Now it feels tight. Before it meant peace. Now it feels like calculation. You start noticing how long it lasts. Who breaks it first? What tone follows when it finally cracks? Comfortable silence is shared. Heavy silence is carried. And somehow, you're the one carrying it. Conversations used to flow without effort. Random observations turned into inside jokes. Small complaints turned into long talks. Even disagreements felt alive, like both people were still invested. Now the words feel rationed. Replies get shorter. Eye contact drifts. Responses come a few seconds too late, like they had to be chosen carefully. You begin replaying exchanges in your head. Did I say too much? Did I ask something wrong? Was my tone off? You're trying to decode what used to be simple. Silence becomes the new language. When comfort lived there, silence meant trust. It meant you didn't have to perform. You didn't have to impress. You could exist without editing yourself. Now silence feels like a wall, like something is being withheld. It's not explosive. It's not dramatic. It's subtle, and that's what makes it powerful. You notice the way they scroll more while you talk. The way, "I'm just tired," replaces deeper explanations. The way questions about their day get surface-level answers. Nothing technically wrong. Nothing you can point to as proof of change. But the warmth is missing, and warmth is hard to fake. You try to bring it back. You tell a story you know usually makes them laugh. You reach for their hand without thinking. You ask about something personal. Sometimes it works for a moment. A flicker of the old connection returns. Then it fades again. The silence creeps back in. You start filling it yourself. Talking more than usual. Explaining things that don't need explaining. Offering reassurances that weren't requested. Because empty space now feels dangerous. It feels like evidence. Silence, when shared, creates intimacy. Silence, when unbalanced, creates hierarchy. The one who withdraws into quiet holds control. The one who tries to break it reveals vulnerability. You find yourself watching their reactions closely, measuring pauses, interpreting sighs. The absence of words becomes something you analyze instead of relax into. And that changes you. You become cautious. You filter jokes before saying them. You avoid sensitive topics. You decide some things aren't worth bringing up. Not because they don't matter, but because you're afraid of being met with that blank quiet again. It's not the volume of silence that hurts. It's the meaning. Before, silence meant we're okay. Now it feels like I'm somewhere else. There's a difference between being quiet together and being quiet apart. In the first, you can feel the other person's presence even without speaking. In the second, you feel alone despite sitting inches away. You start missing conversations you didn't realize were special at the time. The random late-night talks. The way they used to ask follow-up questions. The way they seemed curious about your thoughts. Curiosity fades first. Silence follows. And when curiosity fades, the balance shifts. Because engagement is effort. When one person stops leaning in, the other feels it immediately. You consider asking directly, "Are we okay?" But that question feels heavy. It risks confirming what you're afraid of. So instead, you test the waters with smaller attempts. A deeper question here. A vulnerable comment there. If it's met with distraction or a quick subject change, you retreat. Over time, you speak less too. Not out of choice, but out of self-protection. You learn that sharing deeply doesn't guarantee connection anymore. So you conserve your energy. The room gets quieter. And in that quiet, you feel the shift more clearly than you ever did during arguments. Arguments at least show passion. Silence shows disengagement. Comfort used to live in that space between words. Now uncertainty lives there. You sit beside someone you know well, yet something feels unfamiliar. The rhythm is off. The timing is different. The ease is gone. And the hardest part is that nothing visibly broke. There was no dramatic fight. No clear betrayal. Just a slow replacement of warmth with quiet. A gradual transformation of shared stillness into emotional distance. You can't force comfort back into silence. You can't demand someone to fill it the way they used to. So you sit there, listening to the absence of what once felt natural, wondering when quiet, stoked feeling like home. Control shifting in small moments is almost impossible to spot while it's happening. It doesn't arrive as a rule. It doesn't come with a declaration. No one stands up and says, "From now on, things will be different." Instead, it hides in details so minor they feel unworthy of attention. Who chooses the restaurant? Who decides when the conversation is over? Who sets the mood for the room? At first, it feels random. One person is tired, so plans change. One person is busy, so timing adjusts. That's normal. Relationships are flexible. They require compromise. But compromise is mutual. Control is directional. The shift begins when the flexibility only bends one way. You start noticing that plans revolve around their schedule more than yours. If they cancel, it's understandable. If you hesitate, it becomes a problem. If they're distant, you give space. If you're distant, you're asked what's wrong. Nothing is explicitly unfair. Each moment, on its own, can be explained. But patterns form quietly. Control in small moments is subtle because it doesn't feel aggressive. It feels practical. It feels like keeping the peace. You let them choose the movie because it doesn't matter that much. You adjust your tone because you don't want tension. You drop a topic because it seems to annoy them. Each decision is tiny. Each concession feels harmless. But tiny concessions accumulate. And over time, you realize you're the one adapting more often. Control isn't always about dominance. Sometimes it's about emotional leverage. The person who withdraws affection fastest sets the temperature. The person who gets quiet when upset forces the other to repair. The person who threatens distance, even subtly, becomes the one whose comfort must be maintained. You begin anticipating their reactions before they happen, editing yourself in advance, choosing words carefully, timing conversations strategically. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful, but you're also being careful. Carefulness changes the dynamic. When one person has to manage the emotional climate, the balance is no longer equal. It shows up in arguments too. If you bring up a concern and it somehow circles back to your tone, your timing, your delivery, you start questioning your right to the concern itself. If expressing discomfort leads to them shutting down, you eventually express less discomfort. Not because it disappeared, because it costs too much. Control shifting in small moments feels like walking on ground that used to be solid but now requires attention. You can still walk. You're just watching every step. You notice that apologies come more from you than from them. Even when the situation is unclear. Even when you're not entirely sure you were wrong. Apologizing becomes easier than risking more distance. Distance becomes the unspoken consequence. The person who is less afraid of distance holds more power. If you fear disconnection more than they do, you'll work harder to prevent it. You'll adjust quicker. You'll compromise faster. You'll tolerate things you once would have questioned. And it won't feel like losing power. It will feel like preserving love. That's what makes it so difficult to see. You start measuring your needs against their reactions. If something you want might inconvenience them, you reconsider. If something bothers you but might spark conflict, you downplay it. Your internal dialogue changes from "what do I need?" to "what will keep this stable?" Stability becomes your responsibility. Meanwhile, they move more freely. They speak without rehearsing. They take space without over-explaining. They express frustration without worrying as much about fallout. It's not that they're cruel. It's that the structure now supports their comfort more than yours. Control in small moments doesn't require manipulation. It can happen through imbalance alone. One person becomes more accommodating. The other becomes more accustomed to being accommodated. You start waiting for their cues before making decisions. Checking their mood before bringing plans. Watching their face for signs of approval or irritation. You become attuned to them. But are they equally attuned to you? That's when the realization begins to form. You can feel the shift in how often you lead versus follow. In how often your preferences set the direction. In how often your emotional state shapes the day. When control is shared, both people influence the atmosphere. When it shifts, one person influences and the other responds. And responding is exhausting. You might not even resent them at first. You might resent yourself for allowing it, for not speaking up, for becoming smaller without noticing. But shrinking rarely feels like shrinking while it's happening. It feels like adjusting, like being patient, like choosing your battles wisely. Until one day you look up and realize most of the space in the relationship is organized around their comfort. And you can't remember the last time a small moment revolved around you. Without negotiation, emotional distance behind a closed door doesn't always mean someone has left. Sometimes it means they're still there, just further away than before. You can feel it even when everything looks the same. The routines continue. The schedules overlap. The conversations happen. But something intangible has shifted. There's a layer now. A thin, invisible barrier that wasn't there before. The closed door becomes symbolic. Not just a physical barrier, but an emotional one. You start noticing how feelings are shared differently. Before, emotions spilled out naturally. Frustration, excitement, fear, all of it found its way into the open. Now emotions feel curated, filtered, offered in smaller portions. You ask how their day was. The answer is fine. You ask if something's wrong. The answer is no. Technically, nothing is being hidden. But nothing is being fully revealed either. Emotional distance is subtle because it doesn't scream. It hums quietly in the background. It shows up in the way they don't elaborate, in the way their tone stays neutral even when the topic invites depth, in the way vulnerable moments get redirected into safer territory. You begin to miss the rawness. There was a time when you knew what they were thinking without asking. Now you're guessing. There was a time when they volunteered their worries. Now you sense them carrying things alone, and you're no longer sure if you're meant to help carry them. The hardest part about emotional distance is that you can't force closeness. You can't demand someone open up. The more you push, the more it risks pushing them further away. So you adjust again. You give space. You tell yourself they're just stressed. You lower your expectations of connection for the moment. You become patient. But patience starts to feel like waiting outside that same closed door. You remember how it used to feel when they'd talk without prompting, when they'd sit close and let their guard down, when vulnerability wasn't negotiated. Now vulnerability feels selective. It might appear in fragments. A brief confession quickly followed by a joke. A serious topic softened before it gets too real. You can sense when they're approaching something deeper, and then you feel them pull back, like they stepped toward the door and decided not to open it. Emotional distance shifts the rhythm of intimacy. Touch feels slightly different. Conversations feel slightly shorter. Even shared laughter carries a faint hesitation. You find yourself studying them more, watching their expressions, trying to detect whether the distance is intentional or unconscious. Is this temporary? Is this protective? Is this the beginning of something bigger? You might ask gently, "Are we okay?" And they might say yes. They might even mean it. Because from their perspective, nothing catastrophic has happened. They haven't left. They haven't betrayed you. They're just quieter inside. But you feel the space. It's the space between what's said and what's felt. The space between physical proximity and emotional presence. The space where comfort used to settle naturally. You start measuring connection in small signs. Did they ask about your feelings today? Did they notice your mood shift? Did they lean in or pull back? You realize you're tracking effort. Emotional distance often grows from unspoken things. Resentments not addressed. Fears not voiced. Changes not acknowledged. Instead of confronting them, one person slowly retreats inward. Retreat can feel safer than conflict. But safety for one can feel like abandonment for the other. You might begin questioning yourself. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you expect too much closeness. Maybe this is just what long-term connection looks like. But deep down, you know the difference between stable love and quiet detachment. Stable love still feels warm, even on ordinary days, even in silence. Emotional distance feels cooler, like standing near someone but not quite touching. The closed door becomes less about privacy and more about separation. It represents parts of them you no longer access, thoughts they process alone, emotions they no longer invite you into. You can respect someone's inner world while still feeling excluded from it. And exclusion, even subtle, changes how secure you feel. You start holding back too, not intentionally, just instinctively. If they aren't sharing fully, you hesitate to expose yourself completely. You protect your own emotions from falling into unanswered space. Two people can be faithful. Two people can be committed, and still drift emotionally if the door between them stays closed long enough. You don't need a dramatic event to feel alone. Sometimes all it takes is realizing that the person you used to confide in now feels slightly out of reach, like they're standing just beyond a door that used to stay open. Without question, recognizing the shift before it's too late requires honesty most people try to avoid. Because once you see it clearly, you can't pretend you don't. At first, the changes are easy to dismiss. Everyone goes through phases. Stress happens. Energy fluctuates. You tell yourself not to overreact, not to read into small things. You pride yourself on being calm, rational, understanding. But recognition doesn't start in your thoughts. It starts in your body. You feel it in the hesitation before you speak, in the way your stomach tightens when the door closes, in the way you scan their face for signs of warmth. Your nervous system notices the shift before your pride allows you to name it. Something is different. Not dramatically, not explosively, just enough. Recognizing it means admitting that the balance you once felt has tilted. It means accepting that access, comfort, and influence are no longer distributed the same way. And that realization can feel threatening. Because if the shift is real, then you have choices to make. You can ignore it and hope it corrects itself. You can adapt further and shrink a little more. Or you can address it and risk hearing something you don't want to hear. Most people wait. They wait for clearer evidence. A bigger sign. A more obvious moment that justifies confrontation. They tell themselves, if it gets worse, then I'll say something. But power shifts rarely explode. They settle in quietly. They become the new normal. Recognizing the shift early requires you to trust your perception even when there's no dramatic proof. It requires asking yourself uncomfortable questions. When did I start feeling cautious? When did I begin apologizing more than expressing? When did I stop feeling fully relaxed here? These questions aren't accusations. They're observations. The danger isn't in the shift itself. Relationships evolve. Dynamics change. The danger is in denying that the evolution is happening. You might resist recognition because you fear what it implies. If you admit the balance has changed, you have to evaluate whether you're okay with that change. And if you're not okay with it, you have to speak. Speaking disrupts comfort, but silence cements imbalance. Recognizing the shift also means acknowledging your own role. Not in a self-blaming way, but in an honest one. Did you over-accommodate? Did you avoid small conflicts that mattered? Did you ignore early signs because addressing them felt inconvenient? Awareness isn't about assigning fault. It's about reclaiming clarity. Clarity restores power. When you name what's happening internally, the dynamic stops feeling mysterious. You're no longer reacting blindly. You're observing consciously. You notice that you've been waiting more than leading, that you've been adjusting more than influencing, that you've been prioritizing stability over authenticity. And maybe you understand why. Maybe you valued harmony. Maybe you feared distance. Maybe you believed love meant flexibility at any cost. Recognizing the shift forces you to redefine that belief. Love without mutual influence becomes imbalance. Love without honest dialogue becomes quiet resentment. Love without shared vulnerability becomes performance. The earlier you recognize it, the more room you have to respond intentionally instead of react emotionally. You can say, calmly, something feels different to me. Not as an accusation, not as a threat, but as an invitation to recalibrate. You can observe patterns without attacking character. You can express how the closed door feels without demanding it never close again. Recognition gives you options. Without it, you drift. Drifting feels easier in the short term. It avoids confrontation. It preserves surface peace. But drifting also slowly erodes self-trust. Every time you ignore your intuition, you teach yourself that your perception doesn't matter. And that is the deepest power loss of all. When you recognize the shift early, you protect more than the relationship. You protect your sense of balance within it. You protect your ability to stand in the dynamic without shrinking. It doesn't guarantee the outcome you want. The other person may not see it the same way. They may resist. They may minimize. They may acknowledge and adjust. But recognition ensures that you are no longer passive inside the change. You are aware. And awareness transforms the quiet click of a closing door from something that happens to you into something you consciously decide how to respond to.